So this is the last video on the New Deal, and this looks at lots of the criticisms of the New Deal and also looks at the long-term legacy on American politics. And so Franklin Delano Roosevelt had lots of, I guess, contradicting factors when creating the New Deal. For example, he realized he needed the support of the white South, and so there was a lot of times where he actually overlooked some of the racist practices, such as the Jim Crow laws, because he needed their support to help the economy. This basically gave them further encouragement and confidence to keep enforcing that segregation in the South. And I guess they had a lot of power to implement the New Deal, and therefore lots of African Americans were excluded in the South. However, he did also establish a black cabinet to help represent African American people. So that was a big step in terms of their power and representation. And in general, he encouraged multiculturalism because the US relied on the contributions and talents of immigrants. But lots of people saw significant problems with the New Deal that many people sort of overlooked because they were so focused on rebuilding the economy, and they started to pick up on some of these issues beneath the surface. So one thing that it did is it brought the uneven wealth distribution into the spotlight, and it put, I guess, capitalism on trial, the unfair nature of capitalism. And capitalism is unfair. We've talked about that survival of the fittest type mentality where unfortunately there's big winners and there's big losers. The Great Depression also galvanized workers' unions, which again people saw as a step towards communism. And there was a lot of strikes, by workers trying to bargain and increase their rights as workers. And there was a famous one in 1936 at the General Motors plant in Michigan for 6 weeks, where nationwide car production came to a standstill. The Communist Party of the United States experienced a boom in their membership during the Great Depression to about 100,000 people. From the previous topic, the Cold War topic, you'll know that communism is often attractive to people that are poor and unemployed and struggling. And so the issues that the Great Depression was causing in American society made communism a lot more attractive than it would have normally been. And the Communist Party were also popular at the time because of their opposition to racism, especially things like the Jim Crow laws in the South. And there was a famous incident called the Scottsboro Affair, where 9 African American boys were sentenced to death over the rape of 2 white girls in Tennessee, which is in the South, without much reliable evidence. And so this was a good, I guess, PR opportunity for the Communist Party of the United States, because they stepped in and they organised a flashy show trial with lawyers and whatnot. And lots of people saw this as quite noble, that they were defending, I guess, these boys, and they were trying to break down the barriers of racism. But in 1939, when Hitler and the Nazis signed the Non-Aggression Pact with the Soviets just before World War II, this severely harmed the credibility and the image of the Communist Party of America. Many of the New Deal, acts and agencies were criticised for being unconstitutional. We've talked about the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, where lots of livestock and produce was wiped out in order to raise prices, and the National Recovery Act, giving handouts to people, was deemed unconstitutional, and this received a lot of criticism. FDR and the New Deal was criticised by a lot of people, by conservative people for thinking that FDR and the government went too far, and also by radical people who thought that FDR and the government didn't go far enough. And so this is some examples of criticisms by conservative opponents. They felt like the New Deal was pushing America too far towards socialism, where the government is having too much of interference on the daily life of people, and was ruining that capitalist spirit that America was built on. They saw that the New Deal was adding to national debt, $35 billion, because we've said before, to make money in the long term, they have to spend money in the short term. And so the government, especially in the short term, was going into an increasing amount of debt. It was wasting money on this short-term relief, and they're encouraging people to be lazy. They thought, again, that it was being unconstitutional and the government was getting too powerful. And they thought that all of this power and interference by the government was getting closer and closer towards the president becoming a dictator and giving him too much power, because the courts, for example, started to lose their power, and it was becoming funneled too much towards the president himself. And so conservatives of the New Deal had organisations like the American Liberty League, and although they had money, they were fairly small in numbers, so FDR wasn't too concerned. But he was concerned about some more radical opponents that criticised him and his New Deal for not going far enough. And these people were demagogues, which means they like to whip up hysteria, and they were very good speakers. And this was a group that really concerned FDR, and criticised him for not taking this New Deal far enough. So one of his biggest opponents was the Senator Huey Long from Louisiana, who said that the New Deal relief measures were mere crumbs, and basically people should have been getting a lot more. So a plan that he came up with was to basically confiscate people's money who earned over $5 million per year, and all of that money that was confiscated could be redistributed to American people, up to $5,000 a year for each person. So this was called Share Our Wealth campaign, and he had the slogan "Every Man a King." So basically, everything that was in excess here over $5 million could be shared out among people. And Huey Long was quick to point out that FDR actually came from a very rich, wealthy background himself, and criticised FDR for looking after his people, the rich people, and he didn't actually care too much about the poor people. So that was a strategy that Huey Long came up with, the Share Our Wealth campaign, and that slogan again, "Every man a king, but no one wears a crown." Another radical opponent of FDR was Father Charles Coughlin, who was a controversial radio broadcaster, and he basically preached about the corrupt nature of banks, and there was a bit of an anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish message in here as well. But basically, he thought that people were entitled to to a pension, and these greedy banks and titans of industry were hoarding all the money. And another radical opponent is Dr. Francis Townsend, who had another, I guess it's a fairly practical plan, where he wanted to create a 2% national sales tax on consumer goods, and this would create a $200 a month pension for people over 60, that they could then put back into the economy to stimulate economic growth. And this was another, I guess, practical strategy that was thought up and became popular because people like Dr. Townsend felt that FDR and the New Deal wasn't going far enough, and it wasn't doing enough. And so in response to these three people, FDR created some legislation in response. So in response to Huey Long, he created the Revenue Act of 1935, where he increased taxes on large incomes and corporations. So he started to hit the rich a bit harder, like Huey Long wanted him to do. For Charles Coughlin, he introduced the Banking Act of 1935, where he extended government control over banking practices and tried to limit the power of private banks. And then in response to Townsend, who was pushing the issue of pensions for people, the Social Securities Act of 1935 actually revolutionised the pension system and provided for those non-workers who couldn't actually gain money for themselves. And so in the election of 1936, which is FDR heading into his second term, the Roosevelt coalition became a common term, where he extended his democratic base to appeal to farmers, to urban political bosses, to migrant workers, to Jewish people, to intellectuals, to African Americans. So he really built up a very wide base of support, which kept the Democrats in power for about another 35 years after this period. Another criticism was this infamous court packing scandal, which FDR was involved in. FDR decided to take a drastic step because he was getting frustrated that a lot of his New Deal legislation was not making it through Congress, and so what he tried to do was to kind of rig the court system so that he could have full control over his new laws and legislations being passed. And so he proposed an idea which was to increase the Supreme Court judges from 9 to 15, and for every current judge that was over 70, he wanted to add one more judge, which obviously he picked. So basically it was his way of making sure that he could manipulate all the judges to make sure his laws could be passed. And this came with very heavy criticism because people realised, well, this is a definite step towards being a dictator, having that extra ability to be able to pass laws which are unchallenged. And this was a big blow for FDR's, I guess, credibility and his image. And so that was the court packing system, which was almost a court rigging system, so he could get his legislation through a lot more easily. And you can see this cartoon here on the left, the steps to dictatorship, where step by step he was increasing the power of the president. And I guess in an age where we're sort of leading up to World War II and Hitler is in charge already in Germany, people were very wary over the power of their leaders and how much power FDR was accumulating. So as a result of this court packing scheme, there was a revolt in the Democratic Party. FDR lost significant popularity with people. In the end, he actually got most of what he wanted through. He appointed 8 new justices, but that came at a big price for FDR. So in the next video, we're going to look at the significance of the New Deal, both its successes and its failures, and how it's revolutionized American politics since the 1930s.